Today we're going to start in John chapter 2. This is actually going to be part 1 of a couple part series for lesson 2. So if you're watching this in step with the John curriculum that we're doing here on Sunday mornings, then you're going to watch a couple of these videos this week. I hate doing that, but honestly, this material is going to be about 2 chapters, and so I didn't want to speed it up so much, especially since we're covering John chapter 3 as well. So and John chapter 3 is one of the most popular sections of Scripture, and so I really wanted to have some time to work on that. And so we're going to start out today with just John chapter 2, and we're calling it Feasts and Flipped Tables, which I thought was appropriate given the two subject matters here at play. And so as you can see from our wonderful slides, you're going to be able to see that some of them look really happy. The feasts and stuff, it looks really fun. Everybody's sitting around playing instruments and hanging out together. And the other ones has Jesus with a whip. And if that seems severe to you, then stop reading before you get to that section, because verse 13, 14, 15, all the way up through 22 is pretty much all about that. And so if that makes you uncomfortable, this will be an interesting lesson for you. So hopefully it'll add a little bit of depth to the person and work of Jesus Christ. And so that's what I hope for you all today. So during this lesson, we're going to start out in feasts. So John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And we're going to go through this verse by verse as we usually do here. And we're going to talk about a couple of the things as they come up. And so we're going to get started in verse 1 and 2. And it says, "On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples." Now, these two verses seem like they're not that important, and in a sense, they don't teach us necessarily anything theological, other than the fact that Jesus and his disciples are at a wedding feast. And that actually does tell us quite a bit about what's going on. Why that's important is because Jesus and his disciples being at this wedding feast, being present, means that Jesus is present here with us. That's a really remarkable thing, because a lot of people want to make Jesus out to be just this spiritual figure somewhere up here, and yet we see him and his followers attending a wedding feast, being part of the daily life of his people. And so I wanted to point that out, because that's really the context that we're wading into here in the first couple verses of John chapter 2. And so I wanted to make sure that was clear, that we can't just read past these context verses. We ought to try and seek and understand them as best as we can here right off the bat. And so the question is asked then, what happened at Jewish wedding feasts? Because it's important for us to realize that they didn't celebrate weddings in the same way that we do. I know at our wedding, my wife and I's, we had the wedding ceremony, and it was actually called the Ring of Fire Heat Wave. It was one of the hotter moments in the summer in Gainesville, Florida, and so how much fun that was, you can imagine. I was sweating through my suit. It was unbelievably hot, and I'm 50% sure I forgot half of our wedding, and so because it was so hot. But then after the wedding, we immediately pretty much went into like a reception. So we hung out with everybody. We ate cake for a little bit. We tried to eat food, but everyone was nervous and excited, and you know how that stuff goes. And so and then the food was done, and we went on our honeymoon, and that was really it. That's how most Americans do weddings. But that's just not the case for ancient Judaism. They would have actually come together, and either a week before or after, they would have partied with the bride and the groom. The family and friends and neighbors would have come around them. It was customary for them to feast and go to friends and neighbors' houses for about a week, either after or before the actual wedding. Some of the sources are a little bit fuzzy on what was normal, and so I put either after or before. I'm not exactly sure. Jewish wedding custom was a little different, just because they were coming in having been what we would kind of consider engaged for about a year, but this was a much more serious thing than our engagements. This was essentially they were married, but they didn't live together. They didn't have sexual relations during this time, but the man was preparing the house for his wife. And so this would have been a very serious time. And so either the week ending that or the week beginning their marriage would have been a feast week for the Jews. And this is important because this was a celebration that was a joyous occasion for everyone involved. And Mary knows who Jesus is, and that seems super obvious, but let's read out of Mark chapter 2, verse 3. It says, "When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.'" Now, why is that important? As obvious as it seems, Mary knows who Jesus is. John makes it clear to us that Mary knows that Jesus can do miracles because he is the Son of God. And yet, in the way that she presents this, saying they have no wine, it says Mary knows that Jesus can do this and yet respects his timing if he chooses to do it. He is respected by his mother. And this is an important thing for us to recognize because in that culture, the parents are very important. Your elders is a very important concept to them. And so to see this deference being given by the mother of Jesus to him is important for us to recognize because she knows who her son is. One of the common issues that we get when we read this text, especially in some of our modern translations, is that this next verse is going to sound derogatory, but it's not. In verse 4 it says, "And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.'" Woman is not an unkind greeting. It actually is a greeting of respect, and Jesus uses this when addressing women in general. John always portrays Jesus as using this when he's addressing a woman. So he's not using this in a mean way. This would have just been how you would have said it. This is a weird translation. Sometimes translations might soften that, but the ESV is trying to be literal, and that is the literal meaning, woman. But it was not an unkind thing. This is a common way of speaking and would have just been used to address his mother. And in John chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "My hour," and he says, "My hour has not yet come." What he means by that, what he refers to, is his death and his resurrection. And so when he refers to that, we know that we can assume that he's talking about his death, burial, and resurrection. And we'll notice that later on in the chapter as well, after Jesus cleanses the temple. Remember our other picture, the slightly more violent one. So in verse 5, it says, "His mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.'" And this is a little life application moment for us. Do whatever Jesus says from Mary. I thought that's kind of an amazing way to put it, because if we do whatever Jesus says to do, just like Mary tells these servants, we will do what is right. Recognize that Jesus could have said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do a miracle right now. It's not the right time. And that would have been right. But obviously we have a story here and an account here of what happens, and so we continue into verse 6. "Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water,' and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast.' So they took it." I want us to point out something here, that in verse 6 it says there were 6 stone water jars there for a purpose, for the Jewish rites of purification. I want us to point out something, because these old covenant purification vessels, that's what would have been called the law before the New Testament. This would have been known as a lawful thing to do. This is important to have these around in the Jewish religion. And it's these old covenant purification vessels are repurposed for a greater grace. John 2 verses 9 through 12 says, When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. We're going to stop right there before verse 11, because notice how earlier we talked about this feasting. And so they would have served the good wine kind of right in the beginning. And then after a week, you kind of start to get used to whatever it was that they were drinking at the time. And so likely they would have had a little bit of duller taste buds by the end of the week. And so this would have been common for wedding feasts. And so by the end of that week, this wine would have gone downhill a little bit. It would have been a little more watered down, preparing people to kind of go back out into their normal lives. And but the important thing to notice there is that actually this is a little bit of a foreshadowing of what Jesus offers in the new covenant. He's really saying that he is greater than, better than the other wine, the old wine, the stuff that should have been served then. Jesus is the greater wine. He is the greater grace, as we were just talking about. And this is the first of many signs. And so as we continue to read, it says, This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. And so we get this being the first of many signs which Jesus would do. We're going to continue today with our John chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. And sorry, you'll notice I am wearing different clothes. It's a little bit different time of the day because we had some technical difficulties with the first recording session. So we got up to verse 12. We covered through the wedding at Cana, and so now we're going to begin again with Jesus cleanses the temple. As you notice in our slide, I think it's kind of a funny slide because before it was this nice wedding type picture. It was actually, I got that image from the Louvre, and a very, very nice high quality image. And then this one's a little bit more grainy, but I did like how kind of entertaining it is in that Jesus is here holding a whip of braided cords. And I think this is a very interesting story for us. And one thing I want to encourage us as we go into this lesson on the kind of the flipping tables, or how it's known in the ESV as Jesus cleanses the temple, is that it's important for us to realize that most of the time when we are angry, we are not righteously angry. But Jesus here is showing a righteous anger towards the things that are happening in the temple. And these things we'll get into in just a second. But I wanted to start out by highlighting that most of the time, if we are saying, oh, well, Jesus was angry, I can be angry too, that's not a very good thing to say, because Jesus is God. And when he gets angry, when he gets irritated, when he says things to the Pharisees that we might think are unkind, it's because they're absolutely true and they needed to be said. And so this is one of those examples. And so as we go into this John 2, 13 through 25, I just want us to be thinking about that as we begin to read in verse 13. Verse 13 begins, The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. So there's some context here. Jesus goes to Jerusalem and he sees money changers and people selling sacrifices. Now, in and of itself, this wouldn't have been necessarily a bad thing, but it would have been the way that it was happening. Business would have grown up around the temple, buying and selling sacrificial animals for people who had traveled to Jerusalem and could not bring their own animals. So we're going to start out just talking a little bit about the sacrificial animals. So in Jewish culture, in Jewish custom, and according to the Old Testament law, certain animals would be needed for sacrifices. These would have been unblemished, unspotted animals, depending on kind of their income status. Those might be pigeons or doves, all the way up to to sheep or lambs more specifically. So you can see those regulations if you read through the book of Leviticus. That's why I always encourage people, even though it is a tough book to read, go and check it out, because there's actually a lot of really good stuff in it, because it helps us to understand the New Testament context just a little bit better. But this business had grown up around the temple, buying and selling sacrificial animals for people who had traveled to Jerusalem. Because the reality is not everybody could bring their own animals that far. And so there was some system to allow them to buy those. And the ideal system would be they bought those for a fair market value, and this was a useful service. But obviously something is not going very well. We'll talk about that more with the money changers as well, but this was not being done in a way that honored God, and therefore this made Jesus very angry. In addition to that, money changers were active, exchanging the pagan money of the Roman Empire for that of the Jewish people that was acceptable before God. It wasn't so much that the gold or silver or whatever of the Romans would have been unacceptable. It's the fact that a lot of Roman money had idolatrous images or sayings or writings on it that would have created a problem, and rightfully so. It would have had basically like "Hail the Emperor" kind of language, where it would have been like these coins were saying Caesar was God rather than God being God, and so that would have created issues. And so these money changers would take that money and give them Jewish coinage or non-idolatrous coinage to be able to pay for things in the temple and to do their offerings in that way. And so this is important. Again, this is okay, but not when it's done in such a way as to defraud the people of God as they come into the city. They're charging a high interest rate maybe on this, or they're taking 2 days worth of coins for 1 day worth of Jewish coins, stuff like that. This was not an even exchange. And again, this makes Jesus very upset. And so Jesus fulfills a prophecy, and we get to see this in John 15 through 17. Then we'll look over at Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. 15 through 17 reads, "And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade.' His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.'" Where this is important is that we can go back and we can look at Malachi, which is our last book in the Old Testament. So it's right before Matthew, kind of an easy book to miss, because as you can see here, I'm having to turn really slowly to get there because it's a very small, just a couple pages book, depending on your font size. And so in Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, it says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." And here he's talking about John the Baptist. "And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." And here's where he talks about refining and what he does here in the temple. He says, "But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in former years." I think this is really important because we recognize that Jesus has come, fulfilled this prophecy, and is refining the people. And eventually the system of sacrifice will go away in favor of his one sacrifice on the cross for us, proven by his resurrection. Verses 18 through 22, as we continue, the Jews ask him a question. How in the world are you allowed to do this stuff? You can't just walk in here and flip tables and create chaos. And essentially, he's like, well, yes, I can, because I'm God. But he says in 18 through 22, "So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' Then the Jews then said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple. And will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. It's important. There's a couple of things that we notice here, that Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection. Not in the obvious way, but he's saying, I will do this. I will raise this temple again in 3 days. The Jews are incredulous about this, and they say, it took us 46 years and the support of our king to build this temple. It took us 46 years, but you'll build it in 3 days. And Jesus has some veiled meaning behind this, because this temple will be destroyed, but that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about really is his death and his upcoming resurrection. This serves to confuse the religious people at the time and strengthen the faith of his followers after his resurrection. And I want us to notice here that the good news, the gospel, will do two things when it hits the hearts of people. Either those people will be confused and reject it, hate it in some way, or it will strengthen that which God has given. It will strengthen this faith that the followers of Jesus will have after his resurrection, and we see that in verse 22. I think that's incredibly important for us to realize as Christians today. And then the last section that we're going to go through here in John chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, asks this question: why did the Jews in Jerusalem believe, and why was Jesus skeptical of that? He says, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. And if we stop there, awesome, great, revival has come upon Jerusalem. But there's more happening. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. He recognizes something about the Jewish people. He recognizes something about the people here in this text, and he recognizes that their faith is only based on the miracles, only based on the things that they have seen. There is a difference between believing what you see and observe, and we call that rationality. Our world tries to be more and more fueled on rationality, and having faith. There's a difference between believing what you see and observe and having faith. Often our rationality informs our faith, and John, as we see through our outlines and through this book, lays out 7 signs plus one great sign, the resurrection, that informs our faith. But faith is belief given by God, accompanied by actions given by God. And you can see that out of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. You begin to see that not even our good deeds are things given to us by God. Nothing is our own when it comes to faith. And this is really important, because otherwise we would not get it. We wouldn't move in that direction. We wouldn't do it of ourselves. And so if you look over in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, we'll turn over there quickly here this afternoon. Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 10 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God." And so we see that the faith is given as a gift of God. And he says, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. So he says, no works will do this for you. And then he says in 10, "For we are his workmanship." So he made us, he did this in us. And he says, "created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So every step of our faith walk is governed over by God. Jesus knew that these were not real followers, but they were fans of Jesus' miracles who would later crucify him.